Girlcott, Chapter 13 by Florenz Webbe Maxwell. I arrived home to find my parents in the kitchen waiting for me. Mr. Lewis had called ahead to tell them I had been dismissed early and already left the premises. The moment I entered the room, I was crushed into Mama's arms. Being taller, I could see above her head and straight at Papa, who was standing against the sink, his eyes narrowed and his hands balled into fists. When Mama spoke, her voice trembled. "Are you all right, Desi?" That nickname had not been used since I was 9, when I told her I was too old to be called baby names. Now, hearing it with the quiver in her voice, tears gushed forth. I buried my face in her hair and inhaled the sweet smell of her Dixie peach pomade. "I'm all right, Mama," I whispered. "Mr. Lewis and I had a long talk about the scholarship. He says he's going to work things out." I didn't add that it was Mrs. Burrows who had convinced me that not getting the scholarship didn't mean I'd failed. A tight ball formed in my throat when I thought of the scholarship, but it did not hurt too much after my talk with Mrs. Burrows. Papa's thunderous voice shattered through my thoughts. "They're not getting away with this." He thumped his fist on the sideboard, causing Mama and me to spring apart. "I'm sick and tired of this." His voice boomed, causing a cardinal peeping in at the window to fly off so quickly a streak of red seemed to trail behind it. Now, Lionel," Mama rushed over to Papa and put one arm around his waist. "You know what almost happened the last time you got this upset. You can't let yourself go through that again." I noticed that Mama's eyes collided with his, giving him the signal to drop the subject. "What did Papa get upset about?" I stared at them. The look in Papa's eyes frightened me. "Set the table, Desma," Mama said quickly, dismissing my question. "Set a place for Mrs. Charter. She's coming over for supper. She knows I'm having fried jacks. That's her favorite fish, and she's going to smell it soon." Mama prattled on with a nervous tremor in her voice. "What did Papa get upset about?" I reached into the cupboard for the china plates. She did not answer, but turned her back to me and poured some grease into the frying pan. "Do as you're told, Desma." Papa moved closer to Mama and put his arm around her waist. I became more concerned when he whispered against her ear but looked at me. "We might as well tell her. She's old enough to know." Mama shrugged Papa off and moved over to the sideboard and began to coat the jacks that were resting on a plate with the seasoned flour. Her mouth was puckered in concentration as she lowered them one at a time into the frying pan. The grease sizzled and splattered with a burst of welcome. Mama covered the pan without looking at Papa. "Suit yourself, Lionel. It's your story." Her voice crackled like the frying fish. Papa sat in the chair at the table and signaled for me to sit opposite him. "Forget about setting the table for this minute." I put the stacked dinner plates in front of me and sat down, not taking my eyes from his face. Papa sighed and began. "As your Mama knows, this is not any easy thing for me to talk about, but you are old enough to understand." I had no idea what I had to understand, but I was anxious for him to get on with his story. He began slowly, looking straight ahead as if he had stepped into another world. "What I have to tell you goes back to your grandfather Johnson." His eyes snapped to the present, and he put his head at a right angle, as if trying to adjust his thoughts. I knew that Grandfather Johnson, who had died before I was born, drank himself to death, but little else was ever mentioned about him. I clutched the sides of the dinner plate stacked in front of me, not daring to move. "Your grandfather Johnson bought a piece of property in Somerset," Papa continued. "He built on it a beautiful cottage with a flower garden in the front and a vegetable garden in the back. That was where your Aunt Esma, your Aunt Phyllis, and I were born. All of us were born in this homestead, but the house had a mortgage, and as was expected, your grandfather hoped to pay it off by working several jobs. One job was working in a garage." "Get to the point, Lionel," Mama interrupted. I noticed she had turned the fire down under the frying pan and was now looking at him, her eyes narrowed. "Dora, let me do this in my own way. Desma needs to get all the facts." He stopped talking for a few moments, cleared his throat, and went on. "Your grandfather had a short temper. He would talk back to the white folks without blinking an eye. Well, the boss of the garage hired this young white feller who didn't know diddly squat about a car, much less that the vehicle had wheels. He made so many mistakes, your grandfather Johnson was forced to clean up his mess. One day, your grandfather found out this feller was getting more money than he was. He went straight to the boss and gave him a piece of his mind. To make a long story short, there was a hot argument and your grandfather was fired. He couldn't get a job anywhere. Papa covered his face with his hands and said nothing for a while. I looked across at Mama, who moved behind Papa's chair and put her hands on his hunched up shoulders. I knew from her posture that this story was difficult for Papa to tell. Guilt made me shiver at the thought of putting him through whatever pain he was feeling, but it was too late to turn back. Papa's voice dropped to almost a whisper, and the tremor in his tone frightened me. Nobody would hire him, although he was a good mechanic. The bank pulled in his mortgage and we lost the homestead. Soon afterwards, your grandfather took to drinking. It hurt him to see us living with whoever would take us in like we were paupers. Then one day, we didn't see him for the whole day. He took a long breath like a sob and then continued, his voice remaining low. I went all over Somerset looking for him. His body was found floating in Eli's Harbor, not far from the homestead. Papa, you don't have to tell me anything else, I cried out as a tear rolled down my cheek. You will hear more. Papa's voice was almost thunderous again. You will hear more because your generation take what you have for granted, and you can't understand the pain and sacrifices others went through to get you where you are today. Mama rubbed her hand against the side of his face, and Papa appeared calmer. Although I did understand his story, Papa seemed to have forgotten my pain in losing a scholarship I deserved. I had to leave school at 13 and find any job to help support my mother and two younger sisters, he continued. When I turned 20, I was able to work in the same garage that had fired my father years before. Didn't that bother you, Papa? I could not see myself going back to such a horrible place. Not at all. For the first time, he smiled. The boss had changed by then, but the policy was still the same. Like your grandfather, I was good with cars and anything mechanical, so I learned everything I could and became what the garage called indispensable. There was a method to my madness, so to speak. I worked there long enough to save sufficient money to buy this piece of land for our homestead and build on it before I married your mother. You also bought that piece of land the garage is on and opened up your own garage too, Mama added with pride. You're running ahead of the story, Papa said. What else is there to tell? Papa must have read my mind, for he began speaking quickly, his words almost tumbling over each other. This property and the one the garage is on are worth a lot of money, so I own valuable property, but I can't vote. I didn't understand what this meant, but before I could ask, Papa explained. At one time, only white men who owned property could vote. But when more and more colored men like me became landowners, government changed the rules. What it did was assign an assessed value to our property so that despite the real value, we couldn't vote. Tell her about that man, Mr. Riddles, Mama said, forgetting that she didn't want Papa to tell any of this in the first place. The tone and the way Papa was nodding made me realize that this was also an important part of what had happened. I'm getting to that, Dora. I can still see those two white men standing on the veranda. The spokesman was a tall, skinny one with a bald head named Jack Riddles. The other man, a Mr. Evans, was younger, with a build like a truck. Papa chuckled. Mr. Riddles told me he was interested in buying my property, and the price he offered was so low I laughed in his face. He knew if he bought my property as a white man, the assessed value would go up and he would be able to vote in Pembroke Parish. Now, this Mr. Riddles was known to buy property from colored people in various parishes, property that was undervalued to keep them from voting. So he thought he could buy mine and increase his number of votes in as many as parishes as he bought property. Plural voting, it's called. He even had the nerve to tell me I wouldn't have to move, for he would make the rent reasonable. Papa put his hand over his eyes, and his breath was so deep it seemed to come from his shoes. I remember grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off the very ground he wanted to buy. When I almost choked him to visiting his grave, Mr. Evans jumped in and separated us. Mr. Riddles threatened to take me to court for attacking him. He even told me his partner would be a witness to my abuse. I laugh when I remember the shocked look on Mr. Riddles' face when Mr. Evans stepped back, threw up his huge hands and said he was against the practice of plural voting and against robbing colored folk of their property. He walked away saying he would not be any witness to theft. What happened to Mr. Riddles? I couldn't suppress the excitement in my voice, for Papa's description of this scene was better than what had happened with Mr. Townsend. I never saw him again, but when he left my property, he looked pretty shaken. One look at my face and the feel of my big hands around his neck made him realize he wouldn't have been around to enjoy his spoils or witness my hanging from a rope. I wish Papa had handled Mr. Townsend the same way, but then again, can those white people call in your mortgage? This seemed like the next step to punish us. Papa threw clenched fists in the air and laughed. No mortgage on either this house or the garage. Back then, my buddies, we helped each other build our houses. We all had trades and used them to our advantage. I can still put my hand to some carpentry and plumbing. What happened to my father taught me a lesson. No mortgage to pull in. No siree. I blew out a loud sigh of relief. I went over to Papa and put my arms around him. This time, tears were in my eyes, and I didn't even wipe them away. How come I didn't know all of this? There was nothing you could have done if you did know, Mama said, hugging us both and then going back to the stove. Your Papa learned how cruel and unfair life can be too early, and it almost landed him in trouble. I don't see how knowing about my grandfather and Papa's problems would have. Go easy, Desma, Papa said, patting my hand that was still around his neck. Your Mama's right. I know I'm right, she said with a snort. Too large a morsel chokes the young. We all looked startled when the back door slammed and a loud yo-ho was thrown into the kitchen, followed by Mrs. Charter's broad frame. Even though she had no visible neck, her head swung from side to side as she bellowed. That fish smells good, Dora. Looks like I'm just in time. Watching her eyes dancing up and down on the frying pan, I realized she had no clue that an important conversation was interrupted by her untimely entrance. While one part of me was grateful that I was spared to having to listen to her prattle away about my being grown up enough to be married to some good-looking fellow like Benny, the other part was disappointed that I did not get an opportunity to discuss with my parents the new plans I had thought up for my birthday celebration on Saturday. When we sat down to eat, my mind kept straying back to all I had learned about segregation, and I knew more than ever that my 16th birthday had to be significant. I wanted to help with the boycott, but whatever I did could not involve the regressive group directly. Papa ate in silence as if he too had more important thoughts on his mind than listening to Mrs. Charter praise Mama for being the best cook in Bermuda, if not the whole world. On and on she went, and to my disgust, Mama seemed to be making a feast of her compliments as she jumped up and down, filling Mrs. Charter's plate, hardly having time to touch her own food. Dora, you could cook for a dead man and bring him back to life, Mrs. Charter said. I swear for the 10th time she was holding up her plate for more food. Do you mind letting me have 2 of those fish heads you're saving for chowder? That's if you can spare them. I hate to keep bothering you. Mama took the plate with a smile, piled on 3 heads, and handed back the trophies to Mrs. Charter. I watched in disgust as she reduced those fish heads to a second fate. She caught me looking at her, and a smile danced on her thin lips. I tensed, dreading what was coming next. Mrs. Charter poked one of the heads with her fork. You're getting engaged to that boyfriend of yours? You'll be 16 on that special birthday, you know. I was married to my late husband when I was your age. Papa's head popped up from his plate, and he glared at Mrs. Charter. Hortense, Desma has a lot to do before she thinks of marriage. She has to finish her education. Education can't give you good-looking grandchildren. Desma, we still don't know what kind of birthday celebration you want, Mama said quickly, looking at Mrs. Charter, even though she was addressing me. I wish you would make up your mind. I have made up my mind, I've said, relieved that the conversation had turned in a safe direction. I've decided on a block party. A block party? The duet came from both of my parents. What's that supposed to mean? This solo was bellowed by Papa. I had intended to reveal my plans to my parents after I had worked them out carefully, but Mrs. Charter had a mischievous look in her eyes, and I did not want her to get on the topic of me being out on Sunday night. She was in a wicked mood, a mood to stir up everybody about marriage. A block party would mean inviting the whole neighborhood as well as my classmates. After the party, we could all go to the boycott and support the progressive group. That's my block party with the boycott thrown in to support the event. Since everyone was staring at me, I knew my explanation had to make sense. I don't want a party with my guests singing happy birthday off key, me blowing out 17 candles, one for good luck. I want my celebration to have a purpose. I paused when I noticed the 3 pairs of eyes were still glued to my face. When no one responded, I repeated, I want a party with a purpose. Before Mama could comment, Papa pushed his chair back, stood up, and clapped. A block party and then to the boycott? I go along with that. Sounds sensible to me. His smile was so wide it made his eyes disappear. I had a strong feeling he was getting back at Mrs. Charter for her shallow remark. Turning to Mama and ignoring Mrs. Charter's eager face, he said, What do you say, Dora? Mama had no time to answer, for Mrs. Charter jumped into the conversation. I can provide the food. I eat enough of it. Thanks, Hortense. Papa was still smiling as he turned in her direction. The money I had put aside for the movies can take care of expenses. You'll still need help with food. She was not to be outdone. I can get Lorna Williams to help. She should come up with some interesting food from Trinidad. And Verona Jennings, they would have to volunteer on their own. I was just making a suggestion. I could tell by the way she poked the fish head, aiming at the eye she wanted to take on Papa single-handedly. I was relieved when supper ended on a pleasant note, and my block party was well on its way to becoming a success. Mama included Mrs. Charter, and Papa backed off, saying he was footing the bills and clearing off the land near to his garage to set up tables and do whatever else was needed. Later that evening, I was in my bedroom, sitting at my desk, when Eileen rushed in, threw my books on the bed, and grabbed my shoulders. What's this about you losing the Empire Scholarship? It's not fair. We can't let that happen. You have a right to become an actuary. Slow down. You're making me dizzy. I swung around in my chair and held up both hands. You should be angry. Mr. Lewis called an assembly and told Forms 4 and 5 about what happened. She flopped down on my bed. He also warned us about taking the law into our own hands. It was my turn now to look distressed. Mr. Lewis was supposed to tell the assembly tomorrow. When Eileen remained silent, remained looking miserable, I added, I suppose he has a right to call the assembly behind my back, but I wanted to use the opportunity to tell everyone about my block party plans. Before Eileen could interrupt, I plunged to the highlights of the plans. I told her that my parents and Mrs. Charter were getting the rest of the neighbors to help. I even broke the news that we were hoping to go to the boycott later to support the progressive group. To my relief, she thought it was an excellent idea, especially when I added the part about us going to the boycott after the party. I even mentioned that if we were successful in finally breaking down segregation with jobs and so forth, we could possibly do something about the property vote. Her eyes went wide when I told her about Papa and Mr. Riddles. What a story! There was excitement in her voice. You should have heard Mr. Lewis tell us about the olden days and how colored people were thrown in jail for speaking up for their rights. They didn't have to speak up. They could even lose their property through plural voting, the way Papa almost did with Mr. Riddles. That's true, she agreed, but plunged back into her story. What surprised me was when he told us that white women couldn't vote either. Don't let anybody fool you. White people had it easy. I thought of Mrs. Wallace serving up her loquat joke and offering me my own room as a maid with my own television. She seemed contented with her life. Not what Mr. Lewis said. Eileen pursed her lips together, ready to challenge me with her lawyer role. He told us about this white woman named Gladys Morrill who owned property but couldn't vote just because she was a woman. Her husband would have been able to vote on her property, but he was considered her legal guardian. But he supported her. Don't tell me white women have problems, our problems too. Not anymore, they don't. Gladys Morrill saw to that. She's considered the founder of the suffragette movement in Bermuda. I can't believe white women also had problems, not just us colored people. Good for Gladys Morrill, I said, picturing in my mind a woman who's standing up to those men like Mr. Wallace and Mr. Townsend. I felt encouraged. My words began to gush out like a faucet turned to the limit. That's all the reason I want the Girlcott block party to go to the theater boycott and support the progressive group. I want women and colored people to break down injustice all around. I jumped up and raised my fist in the air. Off to the Girlcott theater. Girlcott? That's no word. Eileen rolled over on the bed and laughed. Boycott is named after an Irishman, Charles Boycott, who tried to evict his tenants over rent. People stopped doing business with him, and that's how the word boycott came about. You can't make girlcott the feminine of boycott. I sure can. For the first time, I was enjoying this debate with Eileen. My boycott is going to be a girlcott. Desma, you can't change the meaning of words in the English language just like that. Her laughter was now reduced to a giggle. I think you better stick with maths. The English language changes its meaning all the time. I folded my arms in imitation of her lawyer posture. It changes to the point where it can get confusing. Look at the word late. Your precious English language also uses it to say a person is dead. So why can't I use the word girlcott to mean the feminine of boycott? Case rests, she said, laughing. I went over to my desk, picked up the paper I had used to scribble down my equation. I had finished it just before she had arrived and was eager to let her see it. Here's the equation I want on my placard. I handed it to her. Benny can do the calligraphy. First, she read it to herself and then aloud. If A is girlcott standing up for justice, then A equals X plus Y plus Z. X is knowledge, Y is integrity, and Z is action. Eileen said nothing but stared at the piece of paper as if letting the print soak through her eyeballs. I could tell that she had something on her mind, so I waited. I needed her approval. I like your equation, she said at last. And I have a jingle to go with it. We need a jingle. A jingle? I didn't know if I was disappointed or curious. She began wagging her hips from side to side as she chanted. Segregation, you'll drop dead when girlcott comes with XYZ. I was so excited I clapped. I like that. That's the Z in the equation, action. We could put that on a placard. How did you come up with that jingle so fast? Lawyer brain cells. Eileen tapped her knuckles on the side of her head. Got to be in competition with actuary brain cells. To be honest, your equation hit it right on the nose. We stomped around the room yelling the jingle at the top of our lungs. My voice was hoarse by the time I collapsed on the floor and Eileen on the bed. What's going on in here? Mama stood in the doorway, then quickly walked over to me. Are you all right, Tessa? I jumped to my feet. Of course I'm all right. I noticed the worried lines that had crept on her forehead. Eileen made up this really clever jingle about segregation. Want to hear it? I heard enough from the kitchen. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. She gave us a smile with her lips pursed together. Then, as she turned to leave, said, I'm glad to see you're happy, Desma. The old timers used to say, you lose the day if you haven't laughed. Eileen sat up on the bed and shook her head when Mama left the room and closed the door. Leave it to Aunt Dora to come up with an old-timey saying. Then she began to chant the jingle, this time without the thunderous racket. I joined in. Segregation, you'll drop dead when girlcott comes with X, Y, Z.